That morning, she had shaken hands across a $30 billion table. That evening, her mother-in-law made her return her jewelry in front of guests like a disgraced servant. Her husband stood there and said nothing. Some people never recognize value until it walks away forever. It started on a Saturday evening in late October, in a house that was too big and too loud and too full of people who all thought they knew everything about everything. The Caldwell family estate sat on the north side of Atlanta, 3 stories of brick and iron gate and manicured hedges that had been photographed for 3 different magazines over the years. It was the kind of house that told you what it wanted you to think before you even stepped through the door. It said, "We have arrived." It said, "We matter." It said, "Do not come in here unless you understand your place." Dia understood her place just fine. She had understood it for 7 years. She sat near the middle of that long dining table in a simple burgundy dress, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her face carrying the particular kind of calm that takes years to learn. Around her neck was a diamond pendant necklace that caught the candlelight every time she breathed. On her left wrist, a thin gold bracelet. On her ears, pearl drops that her husband had chosen himself the week before their wedding. She wore those 3 pieces every day, not because they were expensive, because he had given them to her when he still looked at her like she was something worth looking at. That felt like a very long time ago now. The table was full. Cousins, aunts, old family friends, neighbors who had been invited because Dorothy Caldwell never hosted a small gathering in her life. Everything was catered. The silverware was polished. There were 2 kinds of wine and a jazz quartet playing softly in the adjoining room. Dorothy had spent 3 weeks planning this anniversary dinner, and every single detail was a statement. This family was built right. This family had standards, and anyone sitting at this table had better be worth the chair they were sitting in. Dia watched her husband from across the table. Zaki Caldwell was tall and broad-shouldered and had a laugh that filled a room. He was laughing now, leaning back in his chair, telling a story to his uncle that she had heard at least 4 times before. He was good at that, at being the most comfortable person in any space, at making people feel like they were the ones lucky to be near him. It was one of the things she had fallen in love with once. Now it just made her feel far away. Celeste Webb was sitting 3 seats down from Zaki, and she had been glancing at him all evening in a way that she apparently believed was subtle. Celeste was the kind of woman who wore confidence like a costume. Loud jewelry, louder perfume, a smile that arrived just before her words did and stayed just a moment too long after. She had dated Zaki briefly before Dia came into the picture, and somewhere along the way she had been reabsorbed into the Caldwell social circle as a family friend. Dia had never made a scene about it. She was not a woman who made scenes. She had simply watched and noted and filed things away in a quiet place inside herself, where she kept everything she was not yet ready to speak aloud. Dorothy Caldwell rose from her chair. The room shifted immediately. That was the effect Dorothy had. When she stood, the atmosphere changed, the way the temperature changes right before rain. She was 64 years old, and she had never once in her life been described as soft. She was handsome, dignified, and razor-sharp in a way that she wore like jewelry of her own. She tapped the side of her crystal glass with one manicured nail, and the table fell into an attentive hush. She began to speak about legacy, about what the Caldwell name meant in this city, in this community, in the lives of everyone connected to it. She talked about the generations before her, the sacrifice, the discipline, the standard that had been set and maintained. She talked about what it meant to be part of something built on real foundation. Her voice was warm and ceremonial, and every person at that table was nodding along because Dorothy Caldwell could make a trap sound like a hymn. Then she turned to Dia. She did not raise her voice. That was the thing. She never needed to. She said in that same warm and measured tone that the jewelry Dia was wearing had been part of the Caldwell family collection for many years. She said that those pieces carried meaning and history. She said that it had always been important to her that the women in this family earn what they wear, that they truly represent, everything those pieces stood for. And then she said, with a small tilt of her head and a smile that did not reach her eyes, that she thought it was time for those pieces to come home. The room went completely silent. Not a fork moved, not a glass shifted. Every single person at that table stopped breathing for a moment and looked. Some at Dorothy, some at Dia, and some, the brave ones, at Zaki. Waiting. Because this was the moment. This was when a husband stood up. This was when a man said, "No, Mama, not here, not her, not tonight." Zaki looked down at his plate. He picked up his fork. He set it back down. And he said absolutely nothing. Celeste lifted her wine glass slowly and took a long, quiet sip. Dia sat completely still for 5 full seconds. 5 full seconds of every eye in that room sitting on her face, watching to see what she would do. Whether she would argue, whether she would cry, whether she would finally give Dorothy the reaction she had been waiting 7 years to see. She did none of those things. She reached up slowly and with complete composure and unclasped the diamond pendant from around her neck. She set it on the white tablecloth in front of Dorothy's empty seat. Then she unfastened the gold bracelet from her wrist and placed it beside the pendant. Then she reached up to each ear one at a time and removed the pearl earrings and set them down with the same quiet precision of a woman who had decided that no piece of jewelry in this world was worth what it would cost her to beg for it. She did not cry. She did not speak. She picked up her water glass, took one small sip, set it back down, and then excused herself from the table with a voice so even and so steady that it sounded almost like she was leaving a meeting that had simply reached its conclusion. She walked out through the side door of the dining room and into the cool night air of the estate's back garden, and she stood there alone among the hedges and the low garden lights, and she breathed, in and out, slow and steady, the way her father had taught her to breathe when the world tried to make her smaller than she was. Her phone vibrated inside her clutch. She opened it. A message from her attorney, sent at 7:52 that evening, read in clean and simple language. "Congratulations, Mrs. Caldwell. The transfer is complete. $30.4 billion, signed and sealed. The Monroe Capital Group deal is officially closed." Dia read the message once. Then she closed her phone and placed it back in her clutch. She did not smile. She simply stood in the garden and looked up at the Atlanta sky and let the night air sit on her skin for a long, quiet moment. Then she went back inside to get her coat. She drove herself home. Now, to understand Dia Monroe Caldwell fully, you have to go back. You have to go all the way back to a red dirt road outside of Meridian, Mississippi, where a little girl grew up in a house with thin walls and deep roots and more love than most people find in a lifetime of looking. The house belonged to Wade and Claudette Monroe, and it was small. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that smelled like cornbread, and whatever was growing in the garden out back, and a front porch where her father sat most evenings with either a book or a quiet thought for company. Wade Monroe was not a wealthy man by any measure the world typically uses. He fixed engines for a living, all kinds, car engines, boat engines, farm machinery, and he did it with the kind of patient precision that made people drive from 2 counties over just to have him look at something. He was soft-spoken and broad-handed, and had a mind that was always working on something deeper than whatever was in front of him. He read constantly, history, philosophy, science, scripture, anything he could get his hands on. And every single thing he read, he passed on to his daughter in the form of conversations that lasted long past bedtime. Claudette Monroe was the heart of that house. She grew tomatoes and collard greens and sweet peppers in a garden that the neighbors talked about for years. She sang while she cooked and hummed, while she cleaned, and never once, not one single time in Dia's memory, complained about what they did not have. She made every meal feel like something worth sitting down for. She made every morning feel like it was carrying a gift inside it, even the hard ones. Dia grew up between those two people, and she absorbed everything. Their discipline, their dignity, their deep, unshakable sense of self-worth that had nothing to do with what they owned or how they were perceived. She was quiet like her father, and warm like her mother, and brilliant in a way that her teachers noticed early, and her parents nurtured carefully. She earned a full academic scholarship to Spelman College at 17 years old. On the morning she left for school, her suitcase by the door and Claudette crying softly in the kitchen, Wade Monroe came and sat beside her on the front porch steps. He was holding a white envelope. He told her it was a letter he had written for her. He said he had been writing it for 3 years, a little at a time, adding to it whenever he thought of something he needed her to know. He told her not to open it yet. He told her to carry it with her and that she would know when the time was right. She would feel it. He said the day she felt like she had completely lost herself, that was the day to open it. Not before. She took the envelope. She hugged him for a long time. She got into the car and she did not look back because she knew that if she looked back she would not be able to leave. She carried that letter for 15 years without opening it. Through Spelman. Through her MBA at Harvard. Through her first job at a private equity firm in New York, where she was the only black woman in the room for 3 full years and learned more about resilience in that time than in all her years of formal education combined. Through her return to Atlanta, where she used every dollar she had saved and every relationship she had built to launch a small private investment and land development firm that she named after her father, Monroe Capital Group. Just her name and a shared office space and a belief so strong it functioned like a business plan. That was 12 years ago. Nobody in the Caldwell family had ever asked her what Monroe Capital Group actually was. Zaki knew she worked in finance and investment. He knew she had a firm, knew she traveled for work, knew she took calls at hours that inconvenienced him. He had never once sat down and asked her, "Baby, tell me what you're building." He was not that kind of curious. He was the kind of man who assumed that what he knew was enough because he had never been given a real reason to believe otherwise. His mother was the same. Dorothy Caldwell had made her assessment of Dia Monroe in the first year of their marriage and had never revisited it. Small-town girl, no family money, no pedigree, nothing on her own. Or so Dorothy believed, except a degree and a quiet manner that Dorothy interpreted as lack of substance rather than depth. She had been polite to Dia the way you are polite to someone you believe is temporarily inconveniencing you. 7 years of polite inconvenience. And then that Saturday evening, Dorothy decided the inconvenience was over. But let us return to the days that followed the dinner, because what happened in those weeks between the humiliation and the reckoning is where this story lives. In the quiet, in the ordinary hours, in the things that broke and the things that didn't. The morning after the dinner, Dia woke up early and made herself coffee and sat at the kitchen table while Zaki slept upstairs. She did not cry. She had cried the night before, briefly, in the shower where the sound of the water covered the sound of her, and then she had stood under that hot water until she felt the rawness cool into something harder and more useful. She was not a woman who stayed in pain for long. She was a woman who converted pain into clarity. Zaki came downstairs at 9 in the morning and poured himself coffee and sat across from her and said that his mother meant well. He said it with the practiced ease of a man who had been saying that sentence for decades and had never once examined whether it was true. He said that Dorothy was old-fashioned and sometimes crossed lines, but that her heart was in the right place. He said that Dia needed to try harder to make his mother feel like she was respected and valued. Dia listened to all of this with her hands wrapped around her coffee mug and her eyes looking at her husband's face, and she thought about how strange it was, how a person could look at the same face for 7 years and one morning look at it and feel like they were looking at a stranger, not with hatred, just with a clarity so complete it was almost peaceful. She told him she understood. She excused herself and went to her home office and closed the door. In the weeks that followed, Celeste Webb began appearing at the Caldwell estate with increasing frequency. She brought food. She sat with Dorothy for long afternoon hours, drinking sweet tea and watching old movies and being everything Dorothy had always wanted in a daughter-in-law: easy, agreeable, ornamental, and uncomplicated. Zaki began stopping by his parents' house after work more often. Some evenings he came home smelling like a dinner he hadn't mentioned. He always had an explanation. Dia did not interrogate him. She noted. She filed. She kept working. 3 weeks after the dinner, on a Tuesday evening, Dia was walking down the hallway toward their bedroom when she heard Zaki's voice through the partially open door. He was on the phone. She was not eavesdropping. She had simply arrived at a moment she was not supposed to arrive at, the way a person sometimes walks into the truth by accident. She heard him say that Dia had always been emotionally unavailable. She heard him say that she cared more about her work than about their life. She heard him pause and listen to whoever was on the other end, and then she heard him say, in a voice that was quieter and more certain than anything he had said to her face in years. His mother was right. Dia was never really a Caldwell. Dia stood in that hallway for a very long time. She did not push open the door. She did not announce herself. She turned around, walked back down the hallway, down the stairs, through the kitchen, and out into the backyard. She sat down on the steps of the back porch in the dark, in the cold October air, and she put her hands on her knees and she breathed, in and out, slow and steady. Something shifted in her that night. Not broke, shifted, the way a bone heals wrong after it's been left too long without setting. Something that had been quietly aching for years finally moved into a permanent position, and the position it moved into was done. Not angry done, not dramatic done, just done the way a woman is done when she has finally given herself permission to stop waiting for something that was never going to come. That night she sat in her home office for a long time alone. She opened the safe behind the bookshelf. She did not do this often. The safe held things she kept separate from the rest of her life. The founding documents of Monroe Capital, land deeds, shareholder agreements, financial records that represented 12 years of the most important work of her life. And at the back of the safe, in a small white envelope that was softer now from years of being carried, her father's letter. She picked it up. She held it in both hands. She looked at it for a long time. She did not open it. Not yet, but she held it, and something about holding it, feeling the weight of it, the familiar softness of the envelope, steadied her the way her father's voice used to steady her when she was small and afraid. She put the letter back. She closed the safe. She sat at her desk in the quiet of her office, and she opened her laptop and she began to work. By morning she had made 3 decisions. The first was to call her attorney. The second was to call her board. The third was to stop being invisible on purpose. For 12 years, Dia Monroe Caldwell had operated with deliberate, strategic obscurity, not because she was ashamed of what she had built, but because she understood something about the world that most people learn too late. That visibility invites interference, and she had not wanted any interference while she was building. She had built in the dark, quietly and precisely, the way her father fixed engines in a garage with the door closed. Not because he was hiding, but because the work required concentration. The work required stillness. The work required a space where no one else's noise could come in and disturb the calibration. But the building was done now. Monroe Capital Group had been done for a while, and what had happened at that dinner table and what she had heard through that bedroom door had clarified something she had perhaps been avoiding, that her silence had not protected her. It had simply given other people more room to fill with their own assumptions about who she was and what she was worth. She was done with that now. The Caldwell Family Foundation Gala was held every year at the Rosenthal Grand Hotel in downtown Atlanta. It was the family's signature social event. Press attended, city council members attended, local business leaders came out in their best. It was the event Dorothy used to cement the Caldwell name in Atlanta's social fabric year after year, and she planned it with the same intensity she brought to everything else that mattered to her. This year's gala was 6 weeks after the dinner. The invitations had gone out 3 weeks before it. Dia received hers in the mail, a formal cream card with gold lettering, addressed to her as a guest rather than a co-host, which told her everything she needed to know about how the family intended to position her at the event. She RSVP'd yes. She did not tell Zaki she was coming. She did not tell anyone. She simply marked the date on her calendar and continued working and let the 6 weeks pass the way she let most hard things pass, by staying focused on what was ahead of her rather than what was hurting her. On the evening of the gala, Dia dressed alone in the guest bedroom of her home. She had been sleeping there for 2 weeks by then, quietly, without announcement or argument. She wore a deep navy gown, floor-length, clean lines, no embellishment. On her ears, she wore small gold studs that she had bought herself years ago on a business trip to New York. She wore no other jewelry. She looked in the mirror for a long moment and saw a woman she recognized completely and was no longer apologizing for. She picked up her clutch and her car keys, and she left. She arrived at the Rosenthal Grand at 7:30. The ballroom was filled with 200 people in formal dress, under crystal chandeliers with a live orchestra playing softly near the far wall. She walked in alone, and she walked in straight, and several people near the entrance paused and looked at her with the specific kind of recognition that has nothing to do with knowing someone's name, the recognition of encountering someone who occupies their own space fully and completely. She found a table near the center of the room. She sat down. She ordered water. She waited. Dorothy was at the front of the room near the host table, holding court with a group of city officials and their spouses. She had not noticed Dia arrive. Zaki was near the bar with 2 of his cousins, laughing that big room-filling laugh. Celeste was near him in a gold dress, turned just slightly toward him in a way that was meant to look casual and was not. At 8:15, the MC took the stage. He was a well-known Atlanta radio personality, warm and sharp, and he moved through the evening's program with practiced ease. He acknowledged the foundation's work, introduced the family, led a round of applause for Dorothy that made her beam from the front table, and then, near the end of his prepared remarks, he paused and said there was one more item, a surprise addition to the evening's program that had been shared with him only that afternoon, and he was honored to announce it. He said that Atlanta had just witnessed the closing of its largest private land development deal in the city's recorded history, a $30.4 billion acquisition and development agreement that would transform the city's South Side corridor for the next 5 decades. He said the firm that led the deal had been operating in Atlanta for over a decade, had structured every piece of the transaction without a single public announcement, and had closed the deal that morning with a handshake and a signature. He said the name of the firm, Monroe Capital Group. The room stirred. People turned to each other. The name meant something to the business community in that room. Monroe Capital had been quietly accumulating significant real estate and investment positions across the city for years, but no one had fully understood the scale of it. The MC said he wanted to recognize the founder and lead partner of Monroe Capital Group, who was present this evening. He said her name, Dia Monroe Caldwell. The room turned. 200 heads moved in the same direction, searching, landing, and when they found her, sitting at that center table in her navy gown, completely still, completely composed, not smiling and not performing, the room did not make noise. The room did the thing rooms only do when something genuinely unexpected has happened. It went quiet. Dorothy Caldwell's face drained of its warmth so completely and so fast that the woman sitting beside her reached over and touched her arm, thinking something was wrong. Zaki stopped mid-laugh. He turned. He saw his wife sitting at the center of that room, with 200 people looking at her, and for the first time in a very long time, he looked at her and understood that he had not been looking at her at all. Celeste set down her glass. The MC continued. He noted that in addition to the South Side Corridor deal, Monroe Capital Group had in recent months completed the acquisition of 3 city blocks adjacent to the Caldwell family's primary commercial real estate holdings. Land that had been in contention in Atlanta's development community for over a decade. Land that multiple firms had tried and failed to acquire. Monroe Capital had purchased it quietly through a subsidiary 14 months ago. The transaction had not been announced until now because Monroe Capital had not needed to announce it. They simply owned it. A journalist from the Atlanta Business Chronicle made her way to Dia's table with a recorder and a question. She asked what this deal meant for Atlanta's South Side communities. Dia looked at her for a moment, then leaned slightly toward the recorder and spoke in a voice that was quiet enough that the people closest had to lean in to hear it. She said, "My father always told me to be so valuable that silence becomes its own answer." That was all she said. The journalist wrote it down twice. Across the room, Zaki was moving toward her now, making his way through the crowd with the particular energy of a man who has suddenly and completely understood that he has made a catastrophic error and does not yet know how to address it. He reached her table. He said her name. He said it the way he had said it in the early years. Soft, almost like a question, like he was asking her something he didn't have words for yet. She looked at him, not with anger, not with satisfaction. She looked at him the way you look at a chapter you have already finished reading, with the full understanding of what it contained and the complete certainty that you will not be reading it again. Her attorney, who had been positioned near the edge of the room since 7 o'clock, stepped forward at that moment and extended a manila envelope toward Zaki with both hands. Zaki took it. He looked at it. He looked back at Dia. She had already turned back toward the journalist. He opened the envelope. Inside were separation papers, fully drafted, signed by Dia that morning, the same morning she had shaken hands across a $30 billion table. He stood there holding them in the middle of that gala with chandeliers overhead and 200 people around him, and something left his face that was going to take a very long time to come back. Later that night, alone in her home office with the door closed and the house quiet, Dia opened the safe. She took out the founding documents. She took out the land deeds. She took out the photographs and the shareholder agreements and the folders of financial records that told the story of 12 years of work in the plainest and most complete language that exists, the language of things that actually happened. She set them on her desk one by one and looked at them the way a woman looks at proof of something she always knew was true. And then she reached into the back of the safe and she took out the white envelope. She sat down at her desk. She held the envelope for a long moment. Outside, Atlanta hummed in its nighttime way. Inside, the house was still. She slid her finger beneath the sealed flap and opened the letter her father had written for her. 15 years ago, a little at a time, over 3 years, everything he needed her to know. His handwriting was careful and even, the handwriting of a man who took his time with things. It said, "Dia, if you are reading this, someone tried to make you feel small. Maybe it was someone you trusted. Maybe it hurt in a way you didn't expect. I want you to do something for me right now. I want you to look around at everything you have built. Not what was given to you. Not what someone else decided you deserved. What you built with your own hands and your own mind and everything your mother and I put inside you before you were old enough to know we were doing it. Look at it. All of it. That was always in you, baby girl. It was never about them. Whatever they said, whatever they took, whatever they tried to make you believe about yourself, it was never about them. Walk forward. Just walk forward. That's all you have to do. That's all you have ever had to do. I love you bigger than all the sky you can see from our porch. Walk forward. Dia read the letter twice. The second time she read it slowly, taking each sentence in completely before moving to the next. When she finished, she set it down on the desk in front of her, and she sat in the quiet for a long time. Then she folded the letter carefully along its original creases and placed it back in the envelope and held it against her chest for just a moment, the way you hold something that is both the most painful and the most precious thing you own. And then she put it back in the safe. She closed the safe door. She sat at her desk and opened her laptop and began planning the next thing. In the weeks that followed, the consequences arrived for each of them in the quiet, inevitable way that consequences always arrive. Not with drama, but with the steady pressure of a world that has simply reorganized itself around a new truth. Zaki's professional world shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully trace. Several business partners who had been warm and accessible became harder to reach. Meetings got rescheduled and didn't get rescheduled again. 2 development projects that his family's real estate firm had been advancing for over a year stalled completely. They needed access through land corridors that were now owned by Monroe Capital Group, and Monroe Capital was not taking his calls. He hired an intermediary. The intermediary reported back that Monroe Capital's team was professional and pleasant and entirely uninterested in expediting anything on his behalf. He drove past the land one afternoon and sat in his car and looked at it for a long time. He called Dia 17 times over the course of 3 weeks. She did not answer. His attorney contacted her attorney. Her attorney responded with courtesy and legal precision and nothing else. One evening, he sat in the house they had shared. She had moved into her own place by then, clean and quick, the way she did everything. And he walked through the rooms and looked at the evidence of 7 years of a life and tried to find the moment where it had turned. He could not find it. That was the thing he would never fully understand. Not one moment, but 7 years of moments where he had looked at his wife and not looked at her. 7 years of being in the room with something extraordinary and mistaking it for ordinary because it was quiet. Dorothy Caldwell faced a different kind of consequence, smaller and more social and in many ways more painful to a woman of her particular sensibilities. The women in her circle, the ones who had been at that dinner table, the ones who had watched her strip the jewelry from her daughter-in-law's body in front of a room full of people, now knew who Dia Monroe Caldwell was. The phone calls didn't stop all at once. They slowed, the way water slows when the pressure behind it drops. Invitations came less frequently. When Dorothy attended events, she became aware of a slight adjustment in the way certain people spoke to her. Still polite, still surface warm, but with a new and particular carefulness that told her they were thinking about something they were not saying. She never apologized. That was not in her nature, and this story does not pretend otherwise. But she sat in her house on many evenings in the months that followed and felt the weight of what she had done in a language she understood better than apology, in diminishment, in the slow erosion of the standing she had spent decades constructing, in the dawning and deeply uncomfortable understanding that the woman she had humiliated in front of her dinner guests had more power in this city than she had ever imagined. And that power had been sitting at her table every year for 7 years, and she had spent every one of those years looking right through it. Celeste Webb was gone within 2 months. It happened the way it always happens with women like Celeste, quietly, without announcement, one absence at a time. When Zaki's social life contracted, when the invitations slowed, when the Caldwell family name stopped carrying its previous easy weight, the calculus that had kept Celeste in that orbit changed. She had not been there for love. She had been there for proximity, to a life, to a name, to a world that felt more elevated than her own. When the elevation dropped, she found her way to another orbit. Zaki noticed her absence with a loneliness he didn't fully understand, because understanding it would have required him to acknowledge things about himself that he was not yet ready to see. What all three of them shared in the end was the same essential blindness. They had looked at Dia Monroe Caldwell every day, across dinner tables and through doorways and over the tops of wine glasses, and they had seen what they decided to see: a small-town girl, an outsider, an inconvenience with a quiet manner and a job they had never taken the time to understand. They had seen a woman they could diminish, and they had diminished her, and in doing so, they had revealed themselves completely. Their smallness, their assumptions, their absolute failure of imagination. The tragedy was not dramatic. It never is in real life. The tragedy was just this, that something irreplaceable had been among them, patient and luminous and deeply, quietly powerful, and they had not seen it until it was gone. And by the time they saw it, seeing it was the only thing left they could do. Dia Monroe Caldwell drove back to Meridian, Mississippi, for the first time in 3 years, on a Friday morning in early March, when the light came in sideways and gold across the flat Mississippi landscape, and the air still held a little of winter's edge, along with the first suggestion of spring. She drove herself, alone, with the windows down and the radio on low, and she thought about her father the whole way there. Not with grief, though the grief was present and would always be present, but with the particular warm ache of missing someone you know shaped everything good about you. She turned off the main road and onto the red dirt road she had grown up on, and she drove it slowly, letting the familiar give itself back to her. The smell of the dirt after rain, the way the tree line looked against the late morning sky, the quiet that was a different kind of quiet from any city quiet she had ever known. It was the quiet of a place that had no performance in it, a place that simply was what it was. She pulled up in front of the house. She had purchased it 4 years ago, quietly, the same way she did everything, without announcement, without fanfare, just a transaction conducted through a subsidiary and a restoration team hired under a holding company name. She had it repaired and repainted, and the garden restored, and the porch rebuilt with the same wide boards her parents had walked on. She had never told anyone, she had simply done it, because some things do not need to be explained. Some things are just what you do for the people you love, even after they are gone. She sat down on the front porch steps in the same place she had sat with her father the morning she left for college. She set her bag beside her. She had the letter in her jacket pocket. She put her hands on her knees and she looked out at the yard and the road and the sky that went all the way to the horizon without anything to interrupt it. She reached into her pocket and took out the letter. She didn't read it again. She knew it now, every line. She just held it. She held it and she sat in the sun and she let herself be quiet, in the place where she had first learned what quiet was for. After a while, she reached into her bag and took out a small jewelry box. Inside it were pearl earrings, a new pair, simple and round and cream white, that she had bought for herself on a Thursday afternoon in Atlanta at a small jewelry shop where no one knew her name. She took them out of the box and put them on, one at a time, leaning her head to the side the way women do, and then she sat back up straight and felt the small, familiar weight of them at her ears. Not because anyone had given them to her, because she wanted to wear them, because they were hers, because she had decided. She sat on that porch until the sun moved high in the sky and the shadows shortened beneath the trees, and she watched a hawk circle slowly in the wide Mississippi blue, and she breathed in and breathed out and felt something in her chest that she recognized after a moment as peace. Not the peace of things resolved or enemies defeated or justice completed, though all of those things had come. Just peace. The simple, interior, unassailable peace of a woman who knows exactly who she is and has stopped apologizing for the space that person takes up in the world. She put the letter back in her pocket. She stood up from the steps. She looked at the house her father built. She looked at the road her father walked. She looked at the sky her father looked at on 10,000 ordinary evenings, and she felt him in all of it, in the dirt and the light and the quiet. And she said soft enough that only the air could hear it, "I hear you, Daddy. I'm walking." Then she picked up her bag and she walked forward. Some women are not left behind. Some women simply outgrow the room. And when a woman like that finally walks out, she does not look back, not because it didn't hurt, but because she knows exactly where she is going, and she has always known the way. If you've ever been underestimated, you already know how this ends, because the stories we tell in this place, they go deep, they go real, and you do not want to miss what is coming next.